will live. All right, so it has not been created yet, but we will. We'll go back, we'll start on that tomorrow. We will take all of the questions that have been submitted tonight, and we will transcribe them word for word so that we can be accountable, so that people can see that we acknowledged and got their questions. We're going to try to tackle it in a general way tonight in some different categories where there are some similarities. And then we'll, after tonight's discussion between council, we'll be able to do a little bit more research before we post them online with any additional information that is specific to the individual questions, if that makes sense. So bottom line is, front page of the website, ashlandc.gov, the presentation, everything else that has been asked for tonight to have access to, we'll post that there. And then if questions that are detailed are not answered in detail tonight, if we have to stay at the kind of general area, we'll have the opportunity to post those and then respond more thoroughly to anything on the website.
But
that helpful?
Darla,
Yes,
the
ma'am.
presentation is online right
It
now.
is right now. Yep, the presentation is online right now, and you can go to any of our social media sites. We provided links to that before the meeting started tonight for anybody that wanted to follow along, because we recognize since we're streaming, it's very difficult to see the presentation. So that's available right now. Okay, is that good?
Okay, thank you. All right, so we'll try to get to some of these questions and some of these overlaps. Some of them I would offer are not actually questions. They are urging us to take certain action. So, and again, we're going to have public comment after this, so you'll have a chance to get up and tell us what action you would like to see us take, or give us any other opinion you have on this matter. This question asks, it says that if we were to amend the charter and return to at-large elections, meaning no districts, the question is, why is that option being minimized? So I think what this question is trying to say is, the person who answered this question said, I heard both Mayor Manhammer and Councilman Kapoor say our only option is redrawing districts. Clearly not true. Please state that clearly. And so I think to make it clear, there is the option of amending the charter and or filing a lawsuit. Is that, Brad, maybe you want to expand on that?
That's correct. And we went over 4 options. We can go ahead and say the easy option, just in terms of how much information, is to do nothing. That clearly doesn't require much additional explanation. The 2 big options that are out there are amending the charter. That's a unilateral action. We can do it. That return to all at large is one of the options that is available to the council as part of a charter amendment. The other stuff we talked about, which is just another option we did in great detail, was filing a claim. And obviously in those situations, there are different remedies available, but as far as returning to the at-large elections for all council members, that's clearly one of those rights under option number 1. We just talked about it early on and not so much later on when we were dealing with a different option.
Okay, another question. I think you did address this, but it says, can 168-107, which is the 2-year, the statutory 2-year rule that applies to cities, can it protect our city charter from being re-amended by the General Assembly? And I'll add, assuming the city council amends our charter. You did address this to some extent in the presentation, but maybe to clarify.
Yeah, absolutely. So the particular statute that's cited is in a body of law that deals specifically with the powers and limited authority of cities and municipalities, which means that 2-year hold, I'll call it. In other words, if you amend your charter, you must keep that for 2 years. That applies specifically to municipalities. If we made a charter change, we could then not change it again. It does not limit the state's authority to make changes. The state's authority doesn't come from 168, it comes from the North Carolina Constitution, which doesn't place the same limitations on them.
What precludes the city from changing the year of the election? Again, you talked a little bit about that, but.
So it's a very good question. That was obviously one of the elements, significant elements that was changed as part of the law. Again, when we talk about a charter amendment, The statute that provides for cities to make amendment to their charter is 160A 102. However, 160A 101 actually lists the options, the optional forms of government that the city can implement as part of a charter amendment. And it says you can change your name. You can call yourselves Board of Aldermen, council members, commissioners, a variety of things, and we've discussed several of those. It does not say that we have the ability to change the year. So one would say, perhaps, well, if it doesn't say it, perhaps that means that we can do it. Generally speaking, the law in North Carolina says that we are given specific powers, and we are supposed to read the statutes in terms of municipal authority very specifically. What I'm trying to get at is generally silence on an issue usually means we don't have that power. Also, the North Carolina School of Government has weighed in on this in an article as well and agreed that such a change would require an act by the legislature, not by municipality.
If the districts stand, this question is, what districts would get to vote first? So I think that is provided for in the bill, and we didn't look at the bill here today. If you could just clarify that, does it state which districts would be up in 2020 and which ones would be up in 2022?
It does, and I can try to grab that for you real quick. So,
So we think it's
One, two, and at large.
yeah, that's correct. The first in 2020 would be District 1, District 2, and the at-large member. The remaining districts and the mayor would be up in the following election.
So it's west and central, essentially.
I believe
Yeah,
so.
west and central and at large.
So one question was, why isn't the bill, Senate Bill 813, on display so that we may analyze each part of it? And that bill is available online, and there is a copy of it.
The majority of the bill, for people who can see, is actually a bunch of numbers. It's not something I think you would want to spend too much eye strain on, but the bill is online. It's actually online in two places now. First, you can go to the General Assembly's website, and you can search for, there's a bar at the top that allows you to search Senate Bill, which is just SB, S as in Senate Bill, 813. You just have to select from the 2017 session, which is when this bill started. So if you look in the 2017 and search for Senate Bill 813, you can find it. Perhaps an easier way to find it is that, again, when this happened, it changed our local code. That our local code is actually online as well, and you can look right now and see what the code says based on this change if you just search online for the Asheville City Code of Ordinances and check in the charter section, which is at the very top.
But Brad, can I just ask a quick follow-up on this? I've had a couple of questions about this, and I'm sorry, Mayor, to jump in here, but our charter has already changed by this, right? So there's no action out there that we would have to have changed it. So this bill has automatically done that.
It is
right?
totally outside of our control when this happens. When the legislature ratifies that bill, and this kind of a bill, a local bill, doesn't even require the governor to sign it. So as soon as it is passed in the legislature, it becomes effective law at that point.
So now, is everyone hot? Were you cold and now you're hot? Okay, maybe, I don't, Maggie. She's like, whatever. Okay. Can a city charter amendment be made by simple council majority vote? What's the vote requirement to amend the charter?
That's exactly what it is. It is a council majority vote. As I mentioned earlier, council has to perform a few tasks to get to that point. First, the council by majority vote has to pass a resolution of intent to amend its charter. That gets publicly disseminated, and then the council must have a public forum to allow for the public to comment on that. And then the council has a separate second vote to adopt the ordinance. Now, depending upon which reading that comes in, if it actually comes on the first reading, you need a higher majority, but even by the second reading, council simply needs a majority to adopt it.
This question is, are there other municipalities in North Carolina that have all at-large city council members that the state has not districted?
There are. I can't speak to all of those. Generally speaking, the trend in large municipalities, and I would say municipalities with more than 25,000 people, in recent years has gone more towards a district format. For example, Greensboro, Raleigh, Charlotte, all of these, Durham, have districts in place. Smaller cities in North Carolina currently are more likely to have all at large.
The only large one I know is Wilmington,
That's correct.
in Asheville.
Can the state be made to pay the legal costs if the state loses?
Legal fees are either specifically provided for in a statute, or they can be provided under some other statutes in certain cases. I cannot say that they absolutely would be paid. It's certainly something that you always try for when you make claims in terms of a lawsuit. There is no specific provision in the law that we're talking about that provides for attorney's fees, so it's not a given at all.
So there are a number of questions that really are aimed at trying to ask, would this argument bolster this kind of claim? Would this argument bolster this kind of claim? For example, can it be argued that imposing districts against the 75% of the voters who expressed opposition to districts, that the General Assembly is discriminated against Asheville, as this has not been done to any other municipality? So,
Mayor, we may want to be careful getting into those sorts of areas. And again, I apologize. I know that we have people who are interested in these things, but it is extremely important in terms of maintaining the integrity of any claim we would file that we avoid having me provide you in a non-private forum any specific advice. And advice would include the strengths and weaknesses of any particular argument. Again, not because we need to keep it from the people here, the people who are citizens and listening, but it would make it, under the law, potentially available to anybody who is representing the parties that we may bring a suit against. So we need to be very careful about limiting this with regard to a specific opinion.
okay, so, and again, there's there's a few of those, saying, would this help an argument under one person, one vote? Would this be an argument under equal protection? So a lot of budding lawyers out there. And again, these questions will be posted so that the public can see that they were asked, but.
And then you would consider them, right?
And we can look at each one of
Whatever
those. Yeah,
attorney-
I'm happy to answer any questions that would not put our attorney-client privilege in jeopardy. And we want to provide as much information as we possibly can up to that point. It sounds like a lot of these questions are excellent questions, and they're the very questions that I think council should consider and you should be consulted on in a legal basis. But again, under the protection of that attorney-client privilege in order to have a valid claim, it's very important.
Okay, here's something I don't remember you covering. If the city sues, can they ask for a restraining order from implementing changes until, I think, litigation is decided?
So there's really two questions, I think, there. Number one, this is along the lines of asking for what we call a stay. In other words, the law has been changed, but in some cases you could file your claim and ask the court, while you're taking time to make a decision on this, can we wait and not implement the new law? That is a possibility, and that did happen in the Wake County case. However, those are granted under only very specific circumstances, and they are not easily given by the court. It is more likely than not that a court would not give those stays, but it's not out of the question. To go beyond that, I think I would begin having to talk specifically about the strength of our claim in that regard.
Here's a basic districting question. Would districts have to be contiguous?
There is no specific prescription of how districts must be drawn other than that one person, one vote standard, which really just says you need to account for populations and the deviation must be within a certain area, and you really have to have some kind of a rationale for drawing the districts a certain way. And you certainly can't cross over into a line where you have drawn districts that create a problem, diluting someone's vote or discriminating against someone's vote. But other than that, I think there's a fairly wide latitude to draw the districts in number and area as we or the legislature chose.
And they also ask, can you have one district of the whole, I believe they mean city?
That's a great question. There is a limitation specifically in 168, 101, which talks about the way that you can do districts, and you're given the authority to do multiple kinds of districts. One of the limitations is council cannot have more than half districts, or excuse me, more than half at large. Okay, so you really can't backdoor your way into this. Essentially, what you're really talking about is having all at large, which is an option. So we could just return to at large, which functions the same as having a single district.
And this card also says, "Thank you for the presentation," and you did a
You're very
very
welcome.
good job with your presentation. This was asked, I think you addressed this already, but how many cities have had the state impose districts on them? And I think we talked about how many cities have asked for the state to impose districts on them. It was not an adversarial process.
Yes, I don't have the specific numbers about who have asked and who has had it imposed upon them, but I can tell you that the general trend, at least in years recent, has been that a lot of the, as I said, the larger municipalities have been going to this district either through their own amendment or more often asking the legislature to actually impose the districts on them.
This asks, will decisions made by an elected official in their 5th unelected year in office be legal? Could they be challenged as disenfranchisement or other grounds?
I think that's another good question. We have a situation now where the terms have essentially been extended 1 year. It doesn't say that, but it has that effect because we've moved the election year. I can say that generally speaking, because of the way the law is written, saying that we're going to extend elections out essentially legally legitimizes that additional year of all the terms. It is really a function of what the legislature did, and therefore, again, I think that it would be probably held legally valid that any decisions made during that quote-unquote 5th year would be the same as any other year during the term.
This question asks, and I don't know if you can answer this, is West Asheville getting politically targeted via, and I can't read this word, classism?
Classism, right.
You're really asking a question there, not about the districts in theory, but the actual details of the districts. How are they drawn? And you are getting into an area which is admittedly well beyond my ability as an attorney to say, do you have an issue here? Whether we're talking about race or class, economics, or any other factor, those are things that are considered in the sort of gerrymandering. It's a broad umbrella, but you're really talking about, are we singling people out based upon some characteristic to, quote, discriminate against? That really requires a certain level of analysis that is outside of my expertise, and it depends upon the kind of factors you're talking about, but I don't think I'm able to specifically say that I have the data one way or another to show that.
This says, why did the Asheville districting bill not, I think it's what it's saying is not bar the city from changing its charter?
It's both a good point and a good question. Remember when we discussed briefly the Greensboro case? The Greensboro case not only changed their districts, but it took away the citizens' right to change the charter themselves through a referendum. They got their hands slapped pretty hard by the legislature on that, and that was ruled to be well beyond the pale, a constitutional violation. I believe, having not happened, this is speculation, that if the legislature would have tried to remove the right for us to make those amendments ourselves and do it only to Asheville, I think that they would have had a very difficult problem with regard to the 14th Amendment. So I think that they were, in this case, smart enough to understand what would be definitely too far.
And I would point out, actually, the prohibition was included in earlier iterations of the bill. It was removed. After the Greensboro decision,
Very good point.
while the legislation was still pending. If Asheville can change its charter to address voter discontent, why litigate?
I think that is a question for the council
Okay.
to make a decision on.
Fair enough. All right. This question says, is there a consideration to hire local Ashevilleans to be a part of the social analytics to help offset millions of dollars spent? I'm assuming this is a reference to the cost of litigation that you spoke of in your presentation.
And that includes both attorneys and experts. Remember, as I will openly admit, I am not the expert on some of these analytical techniques that would be required. Certainly, there would be experts needed along both legal and analytical fields in order to sustain the necessary evidence to have a claim. The council is vested with the decision of awarding contracts, and I certainly think you're up to that task.
This question, this is two-parter. So first, what were the years of the Greensboro and Wake County decisions?
The Greensboro case, I believe, was 2017, and I think Wake was 2016.
If those decisions were made before 2019, which we now heard that they are, what impact does the Thomas Hofel, I'm not sure if I'm saying his name right, but this is the deceased fellow with the data on his computer, situation have on future state court rulings potentially? Documentation of the Hofeller's computer showed that racial data was used to redraw all districts and that North Carolina leadership lied about the time frame during which districts were drawn. Is it possible now to argue racial gerrymandering in any part of North Carolina, or could it be possible?
Well, first and foremost, the case that evidence is being brought out in is an existing case. That was the case that just went through the U.S. Supreme Court and is now back into the state court. So I would say the first answer is yes, that not only is available, and it's being considered in that state court case. Clearly, that evidence wasn't made part of the federal case at the time. I don't know that it would have mattered or not to our Supreme Court. But with regard to a state court, I think that we are going to see whether or not that would make a difference based upon what happens in that case.
Okay. This question, I don't know if you can answer it, but what is the North Carolina General Assembly's potential rational basis for districts versus at-large elections?
So again, that rational basis is that what we call that low bar, that low test that they would have to meet. And the cases have given some specifics on what constitutes a rational basis. I'm happy to read these. I will go ahead and let the cat out of the bag that these may be unsatisfactory to you, to tell you they don't give a lot of information. But the courts have said things like considering population equality, which is what we talked about in terms of making sure that if you do have districts, they have similar populations. And in many cases, as I think I also said, districts are put into place in order to protect against certain forms of racial discrimination. The courts have also cited community boundaries in terms of keeping those together as opposed to breaking them up. Geographical compactness. These are buzzwords to a certain extent, but they're being pulled directly out of case law as reasons that the General Assembly found, or excuse me, that the federal courts have found were sufficient. Another one that's often cited is things like for moving election years. What you often find is it saves cost because it lumps many elections together. That was found to be a rational basis. Really, in terms of thinking, why does this matter? You can see that that rational basis bar is in fact pretty low. It's not really the specific elements as much as they don't say much. It really, under the court's view, hasn't taken much for them to have some reason to have districts or to draw them in a certain way.
Okay, you answered this. So if the General Assembly were to amend our charter again, would the governor have to sign that new decision into law? And you already said this is a local bill. The governor does not have to sign it for it to become law.
That's correct.
Can
Or
citizens,
can he then veto it?
he also cannot veto it, right? Can citizens who have, I think this is saying, can citizens bring their own lawsuit instead of the city, especially if the city decides to do nothing?
Yes, and we saw that in the Wake County case. The Wake County was not brought by the county. It was not brought by the city. That was brought by a group of citizens who formed an association and filed the suit as the plaintiffs.
And just to follow up to that, though, Brad, this might get back to something you mentioned earlier. If if we do decide to change our charter, and then a group of citizens brings a lawsuit, it essentially might be moot because we would have already changed the things that the lawsuit would be claiming need to be changed.
That's probably correct. If we think about this law, the real effect doesn't happen until an election occurs. In other words, what you changed is a framework right now for what will happen in the future. So if the changes were made to the charter by city council to amend and take us back to something similar to what we've had before, or really to anything else, the city council is then on the hook for the charter and the government form that it puts into place. So we may essentially, as you said, by amending the charter, render that potential claim moot if it's done before an election occurs.
So here's another question that I think is going to be helpful to clarify. Can the city amend to 3 districts that follow the police service districts, which are drawn based on call load and population? Consider 2 members from each of the 3 districts, or 1 each and 3 at large. So I think you already said that the statute, the menu of options given to cities in changing our own charter has some limitations on the way districts are drawn. So talk about that again, about what number we would be allowed to do.
Yes, so let's start with the easy part. With regard to how many at-large you can have. If you have some form of districts, you can't have more than half the council be at-large.
Okay.
That's in the statute. So if you have districts at all, as opposed to all at-large, this council, under its current size, couldn't have more than 3 people who were at-large. That's a limitation. Secondarily, in terms of how many districts you want, well, that's going to then affect how many at-larges you have. So if you decided we just want 2 districts and everybody else be at large, you're now running afoul of that limitation. So there is going to be necessarily a limitation on how many districts could be drawn based on that.
Could you have 3 and have 2 council members from each district?
So the way that the statute is written, there is not a lot of detail given in situations regarding whether the mayor is a voting member of council or not. It's written as if the total number, when it's talking about no more than half, contemplates, I believe, the voting membership of council. So we have 6 members of council and a mayor, but our mayor votes.
Which
So
is
I-
not typical.
Which is not typical. But I believe what that would do under the statute was limit you to essentially say you have 7 people who are voting members. We're not going to allow you to have any more than 3 at large, which means if everyone else is in a district, you're probably not going to have more than 4 districts,
And the question of whether you could
or
follow.
less than 4 districts, excuse me.
The question of whether you could follow the police service districts, also that would get into the question of the 10% variation limitation. We don't know the populations exactly of those districts.
Yeah, you're going to have to protect, just as the legislature is supposed to, the integrity of that one person, one vote rule, and keep within that 10% population division.
Okay, I'm almost done here. Has Raleigh, the legislature, stated a motivation for the districting measure?
You know, I have read briefly some of the legislative history that went behind that. I think that again, it's important to remember that this went through a few iterations. So there was an initial bill, as the mayor mentioned, where we had 6 districts and no at-large. And there was a lot of discussion regarding representation being guaranteed from South Asheville at the time, where the council had a history of not having anyone from that part of Asheville being elected. So there was some indication that there was a desire that that be at least some of the basis, that that area of Asheville had representation. But I couldn't comment beyond that. I haven't read it recently enough to remember all the rationale they put forth.
In theory, if we were to amend our charter, could we include other provisional changes? For example, municipal control of the TDA, the Tourism Development Authority.
That's a good
That's the question.
I love that question. I hate my answer. I don't believe that we could. And the reality is, we have a lot of options in Chapter 168-101 to amend our charter. That is not one of them.
Okay, the next question, I'm having a hard time following, but I'm going to try this. If we were to file a claim, or present a charter amendment before the 2020 election with the express request to hold primaries. Could we hold said primary while the motion is in the wings? I guess while the charter amendment is still pending or the case is still pending? And perhaps use those results as evidential claim for disenfranchisement, dissolution of voter choice.
I think the short answer to this question is that if we did a charter amendment, and let me say what I think I'm hearing here. Could we do sort of both paths together and try to get the best of both worlds? I think that the answer to the question is that if we did a charter amendment, you are essentially rendering a lot of the claim you would potentially make moot. Because once we do a charter amendment, the law is changed. And it would be very difficult to say we are now injured by a law that's no longer in place because we would have changed that law at that point. So I think it would be difficult to do both at the same time, at least in regard to everything.
Here's an important question. Is there a process? The question is what kind of petition number of signatures would be required to, I think what it's saying is if the council did not take steps to amend the charter, is there a process for a citizen-initiated charter amendment?
The answer is yes, there is, and I can tell you that
I think it's
very specifically where this is found in the statutes. Let's see. It is found in Chapter 168-103, and what it essentially says is that if citizens wish to initiate a petition to force a referendum on a charter amendment, it requires, first of all, a petition to be submitted with either 5,000 signatures or 10% of the total registered voters within the city. I think whichever is less, so I think it'd be 5,000 here in Asheville. And then there is a process in terms of the timing and how that works, but that's
There is
listed
a
in that
process.
statute.
And Brad, you had that up on your slide earlier. Does that, if the city starts down this road of doing a charter amendment or even changes the charter without doing a referendum, like for time's sake, if we just needed to do that, then somebody who's maybe not happy with that charter change could then institute this process that you're talking about.
That's exactly right. 168-1002 allows for the council to initiate the charter amendment with or without a referendum. Council has that option. Now, the voters can initiate their own referendum via this petition process that we discussed, but council is not required to have a voter referendum to do this.
And if that happened, so let's just say, for sake of argument, that city council changed the charter this year, and we go to, primaries in March and general election, no districts, primaries in March, general election in November. But a group of citizens was successful in terms of getting a referendum on the ballot. Would that be then, do you know which of those ballots it would be on, or does the statute say?
It's not going to be backward-looking, which means if we've already had elections under what's occurred to that point, under whatever the framework is, it's going to apply to the
next
next
election.
election.
Okay, so we would go through one cycle at the.
Yes,
at
and let me say that if there's a charter amendment, and then there is a petition by the voters to, say, perhaps disapprove that charter amendment, then, and that's done within a timely fashion per the statute I mentioned, then our amendment as a city would be stayed until the referendum happened.
I have a question. Wow. What are the methods of the citizenship to bring forth a referendum on any item, notwithstanding a charter amendment? So basically what I'm saying is, what is the methodology of the citizenship of Asheville to bring forth a referendum in opposition of whatever the General Assembly does?
There is not a specific right of referendum on everything.
Right.
It's given in certain circumstances. The one we've talked about here, which is 168, 103, is specific to a charter amendment. There are some other situations where referendums rights are given, but again, just like our city has to be given a right by the legislature to have it, the same referendum rights are given under specific circumstances. I can't tell you what all of those are, but it's only in certain circumstances.
Would
For
definitely like to
example,
explore those.
they're very limited, but for example, we were allowed to have a referendum to ask voters about whether they wanted a transfer of the water system.
A question.
But yeah, a non-binding
Right.
question, but that's because there was a particular statute dealing with the transfer of utilities that allowed voters to be asked that question. So it was very,
It is
we're not like
limited.
other states.
It is limited in this state how many options voters have to initiate a petition for referendum. And generally speaking, it is left to the right to vote for council members to do those things legislatively.
Right, just, specifically what I was getting at was there may be citizens out there that may want to voice their opposition to this sort of action from the North Carolina General Assembly and may want to act on their own behest of gathering signatures to specifically voice their dissent on these sorts of actions, albeit we don't know what those, what allows them to do that. I would like to explore that, whether it be personally or through you, but to find out what those methods are, even if it's a basic question.
Yeah, we can certainly talk more about that. I would say that it would require a little more research than what I have in front of me today. And again, my only limitation would be that I'm not able to give any specific legal advice to any citizen about those
Understood.
things.
Thank you.
Okay, and I have just a couple more. What is the exact rationale for council not being able to amend the election cycle to odd years?
So it's not a question of rationale as it is authority, I believe. The previous elections were held in odd-numbered years. The legislation, Senate Bill 813, changed that to even-numbered years. And if we're talking about doing a charter amendment to address this, as we've said, we have a number of options that we can change about our form of government. That is not one of them. It's specifically excluded from our authority to make a change on. So when we're talking about changing based on a charter amendment, that is just one power out of all of the powers that we have that wasn't delegated from the legislature to cities.
Well, and Brad, you haven't seen anything in the cases that you've looked at that would lead us to believe that, or have you, that a legal challenge would also, like, we don't, I heard you say we don't even have a basis for a claim on that.
I have not seen a claim brought on that basis, and I can tell you in North Carolina, it is still odd that we have it now in even-numbered years as opposed to odd-numbered years as a municipality. I believe that there are currently, including Asheville, 6 municipalities that have their municipal elections in even-numbered years. However, the trend seems to be going in that direction, in moving even municipalities towards the general election cycle in even-numbered years. And the General Assembly, I believe, earlier this year or last, passed an initiative to begin studying that to be done on a statewide basis.
This is a question requesting clarification on the process for amending the charter under the circumstance where the council votes to amend the charter versus the council initiates a process that results in a referendum vote to amend the charter. And, right, okay, so, maybe not.
Specifically, you had mentioned it would take 4.5 months. There was information that the mayor had linked to, and said it would take 90 days, plus 2 meetings with an intervening regular scheduled meeting, which sounds like it could be 3 months and a week.
Okay, so to amend the charter without the legislature's help can be done in 2 ways. One is the council does it unilaterally through a process, and the other is the council initiates a process that results in a referendum which we've done before. Can you talk about the timing, I guess the timing differential there?
Yeah, and this comes directly from 160A-102. This is the amendment ordinance, and I can tell you specifically what it says. In order for the council to amend the charter, the council shall first adopt a resolution of intent to consider amending the charter. That's done at a single meeting. All right? Then, I'll skip the stuff you don't want to hear. At the same meeting, council can also set the public hearing, which is also required for community input on that. Now, The date of the public hearing must occur not more than 45 days after adoption of the resolution, but not at the same meeting. Then, following the public hearing, but not earlier than the next regular meeting of council, and not later than 60 days from the date of the public hearing, the council can consider and potentially adopt the ordinance. So generally, it's 3 meetings of council to do that, and then the additional period is the 90 days that we discussed between the adoption of the ordinance and the election that's required by the statute.
Okay,
I hope that makes sense.
so hopefully that helps. And obviously, the referendum option wouldn't work because the referendum would actually be voted on when?
So council can add that as part of the process for amending the charter. It can say that this charter amendment is going to be subject to a referendum.
Right.
At which point, then you're just in the next election cycle for a referendum to happen.
Which sort of defeats the point of amending the charter in time to move back to an at-large system.
Exactly.
All right. Okay, so lastly here, what about the impact of voter ID requirements creating an impact on one person, one vote, or racial discrimination? So I think this was a question I saw raised about voter ID requirements will come into effect for the 2020 election cycle. And would that, in your mind, have any impact on the legal arguments, I guess?
There certainly is a legal argument around this to be made, and I think it's being made. With regard to specifically what we're talking about, nothing in the ordinance, or excuse me, the state statute that was passed, Senate Bill 813, dealt with this issue specifically. So this would be a tangential issue in terms of if you're trying to calculate votes and maybe look at that one person, one vote, maybe there would be some aspect of that that would figure into the calculation, but that wouldn't be something that's been altered in any way specifically by this statute. It simply wasn't addressed.
Okay, and then finally, the question here, and again, if I didn't specifically read your question, it was mostly because it was either telling us something to do, or it was providing a legal argument you think we should be making. This question is, what option is city council considering at this point? And I think that's a very good question. So as I said at the beginning, there's not a vote to be taken at this work session, but it is anticipated that the council will need to make a decision around the options that have been presented here tonight. And obviously, with the timeline required, that will need to happen sooner rather than later. So hopefully that's clear. Again, these will be posted. I don't see Dawa, but I know. And thank you for making them legible. That was very good. Okay. So unless council has any other questions for Brad, I'm going to let Brad sit down, and we're going to hear from you all. This will be just like public comment at a city council meeting. You'll need to state your name, and you'll have 3 minutes to speak. We don't have any buzzers. What are we doing for buzzing? Or lights, or?
No buzzers, no lights.
Maggie will tackle you. We are trying to keep the discussion tonight focused on districts. So if you could please try to do that as well, that would be terrific. Okay, so just go ahead and, all right. Andrew, go ahead. Oh, Brad, do you want your computer to be up there? I don't know. but-
Right.
Do you want your?
Someone has a PowerPoint.
Oh, okay, well, there you have it.
Good evening. My name is Andrew Fletcher, and I oppose the districting of Asheville. I was one of the 11,726 that opposed it in 2017, and unlike some of you, I've not changed my mind. I believe that districting would not only disenfranchise me from being able to vote for and against members of this body, it would also disenfranchise my African-American neighbors from being able to pool their votes citywide and elect representatives sensitive to their needs and challenges. This is not Alabama in 1964. This is Asheville in 2019. We can do better. Do not sideline and subdivide your voters. Empower them. Give them their voices back. Bend the arc of history as far as you can toward full inclusion under the sacred principle of one person, one vote in every council race. All cities are different. What makes Asheville different is actually why I'm here, why I choose to live here. And all districting schemes are different. In some cities, districting might further the purpose, guaranteeing more equal representation. But the unique local history of urban renewal and gentrification makes ours a different case. Asheville will be deeply wounded by districting, old wounds made fresh again, just as we're starting to heal from them. And if you wonder why the past week has been rough on some of you, Julie, it's because some of the effects of districting are already here. The conventional wisdom says politicians react to the last election, but this week shows that politicians really ignore past results and respond solely to the coming election. I haven't talked with anyone who thought the Flatiron vote would have gone down like that if we were in the middle of an election cycle right now. I won't blame the Flatiron Hotel approval squarely on Julie's shoulders. I'll blame it on the fact that Democratic complicity with GOP districting and a delayed election cycle, Julie was given every indication that she could indeed get away with something so unbelievably unpopular. Reinstate the nonpartisan primary, fight the districts, amend the charter, give us back our city. And I'm going to finish with a pledge that I'm going to invite other speakers to repeat. I pledge to oppose districts. I pledge to vote against any politician that forced districts upon our city, that was complicit with districts, or that failed to fight districts. I make this pledge for one simple reason. If you won't fight for us, how can you possibly expect us to vote for you? Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so our same no clapping rule applies even though we're here. We feel like we're on vacation, but we're still in a council meeting. So thank you. Remember this, you just tell us this is good, this is bad. Okay. All right, yes, Sheila.
Hello, my name is Sheila Surratt, Asheville native, unlike most of you all. June 27, I went to Raleigh to speak to the Elections and Ethics Committee to move SB 285 to the House for votes. Already passed the Senate. Not one of you showed up to speak against the bill. Instead, you sent an overpriced lobbyist. If you all didn't want districts, each and every one of you should have shown up and spoke. So June 2018, the bill was revised, SB 813. This will cost over millions of dollars if you sue the state, more wasteful spending. That money could be used to give our firefighters better pay and retirement benefits they deserve. It's pure awful how you all treat our firefighters. You had the chance to draw district maps, you all refused. You all don't want districts because you have to be held accountable, which not one of you are held accountable. We could use that money to clean up our town and fix our sidewalks. Start listening to we the people, not choose the people. We are going to vote you out 2020. How is the hotel business working for you all?
So let's try to do, just so we get everyone's, that I don't get all lopsided here, we'll try to do what we do sometimes where we do for or against. I guess that'll kind of work here, I'm not sure. So I think we heard a against and a for, and I'm guessing against. So Nina, you want to go?
Good evening. My name is Nina Tovish. I learned a lot this evening. I really appreciate the presentation that we had. In response to the charter amendment question, if my understanding is correct, 168-102 lays out the process for council to unilaterally amend. And if that's the case, it also specifies specific minimum times and maximum times that certain things have to happen. Given that we've had a year of inaction on this question, I would like to urge council to move in an expedited fashion. If you choose to amend the charter, which I hope you will do, and return us to at-large elections and primaries, I urge you to do this using the minimum amount of time provided in the statute so that people who might want to run for office have the opportunity to get going before a primary in March. So that's my first request of you. My second remark is simply to say that if council chooses not to take action in a timely fashion, I, and I'm sure many others present here, will choose to exercise our rights under 168-103 and put together a petition to make this happen. And we will do that with all deliberate speed. And I'm happy to sign on to Andrew's pledge about the next cycle of elections for those of you who contemplate not moving forward on returning us to open district. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, is there anyone who wants to speak in favor? John, are you? I don't.
I'm confused. What are we in favor of?
Good question.
John Mile, I'm a Asheville resident and native. Brad, I want to say I'd never met you, seen you before tonight. I commend you. Excellent presentation. Having worked with many city attorneys in my career with the city, I can say you're as good as any I ever saw. If this gig doesn't work out, the Institute of Government is always looking for people of your caliber. Good job, good job.
Thank you, sir.
6 years ago, when I ran unsuccessfully against Her Honor, we were asked at a community forum whether we favored districts or not. I said I did not. And at the time, I did not. And there's a part deep inside of me, the strict constitutionalist mentality I have, the political science major I had in college. There's a part of me that says we shouldn't have to do this. But I honestly think the time has come. I've changed my mind. Rather than what we heard a moment or two ago, I would offer quite the opposite. These campaigns now are upwards of $40,000 and more. It's not just a race for anybody. It's an elitist race, and I'm not calling the people in front of me elitists, but it's become who can raise the most money and get the cabal together to support them. Think about the alternative, which is all politics is local. We've all been told that our whole lives. Somebody who's active in their child's school or in their church or their synagogue has a very good base from which to launch a campaign for very little money within a district. Some of you, I know, maybe not. There may not be a soul in this room who remembers Joe Skalski. I think that was his name, Maggie. Back in the 80s, Joe was a guy from Hall Creek who thought, I want to be on council. I want to be on council. And he got his kids to sit down with crayons and coloring pens and some paper board, and they created his yard signs. And he got elected. His total expenditure, as I recall, was under $100. We could open this process up, in my opinion. All I would ask is if you're going to do anything, do the least amount of damage possible. Take the position that this has been thrust on you. You had chances all along to address this, and as a council, you chose not to. You had the chance to draw your own districts, and you chose not to. For the love of Hannah, don't spend any more taxpayer money trying to fight the state of North Carolina over something that you know is not going to be successful. Take your medicine, make the best of this, and open the process up to people that might want to serve. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, I told Maggie I'd keep the timer, but then I forgot to keep the timer. Okay. You're right. Okay, yes. Back there.
My name is Matthew Bird. I'm a business owner in the city of Asheville. I'm here to oppose districting. I had a thing written earlier, but thank you, City Attorney, for addressing most of what I came here to say. We have the power to amend our city charter. It is unquestionable that we have that power to take it back and do what the voters asked for. 12.75% of city residents, far more than is required for a referendum, voted against districts in 2017. The city has failed to uphold the will of the voters in that by not having this discussion earlier. If we move forward with districts, we will be disenfranchising districts until 2023. We will have 3 districts that do not get representation until that year. I think that is extremely important to note. We have city council members who will sit longer than their terms are constitutionally allowed. There's so much more to say. I'm going to have to stand by my friend Andrew Fletcher's pledge against any council member who votes to impose districts in any way. If we amend our charter, we need to amend it as close to the original charter as possible. And I believe that I know I'm not an attorney, and I appreciate Brad's expertise on the matter, but I truly believe that it is clear in General Statute 160A-107 that if we amend it, it is protected for 2 years. There's no language in SB 813 that says that their ruling is put in place for 2 years. That charter change is a charter change plan. And GS 160-107 makes it very clear that any changes that follow the procedures of that article, Article 5 of GS 170A or 160A, are protected by a 2-year plan. If we make this move forward, then our election cycle should be protected by the amendments we make. That constitutionality comes to allowing elections to take place without being interrupted by changes from the General Assembly. And I think that would be a very clear stay that we would have. That's all I have to say.
Thank you. Okay, anybody? Blake?
Good evening. I'm Blake Esselstyn, 5 Points Neighborhood. Thank you for having this meeting, and thank you for the presentation. I think under a lot of scenarios, we've heard about the situation where council would be redrawing the districts in 2021. And I guess I have 2 questions, one more general and one more specific. I'm curious about what we know about what that process looks like. There's been a lot of consideration of the districts as they're drawn in SB 813, but that will only apply basically for 2 council members getting elected, and then going forward, these would be districts that would be redrawn. How? So I'm curious, I know you don't have to respond to my question, but if it's not to be discussed tonight, it's something that I'm hoping would be discussed in the future. And then specifically, if, as was discussed, the western and central districts have council members elected in 2020, let's say, just for the purposes of this argument, that that's Councilman Young and Councilwoman Mayfield, because they live sort of close to the lines, and then the districts are redrawn in 2021, do those have to be drawn in order to make sure that those 2 council members are living in the district in which they represent? Is that a constraint?
Yes.
And then,
But that's election law. We're getting into election law, yes.
okay. That would, the districts would be required to be drawn. However, the other incumbents, would their addresses be considered? These are questions that I'm curious to hear more about, whether it's tonight or.
You should have written these on the cards.
I don't know that was a question for the attorney as so much as, my understanding is that this is there's some council discretion on this. And I think it's important to the discussion to know what the process will be for determining districts moving forward, should the districts persist. Thank you.
Well, so just to answer those questions, Representative Turner did make an amendment to the bill that preceded 813 to call for an independent commission to draw districts. And then there was a kerfuffle in the legislature because I think they suddenly realized that they mandated an independent commission to draw districts. And realized that might be a tricky precedent for them to live by. And so it wasn't made mandatory. But I think there would be an option. The second question about where incumbents are located, under general redistricting election law that I only know about because I did redistricting when I was an attorney in the state legislature in the year 2001, says that there are a number of considerations you have to give when you draw districts, and one of them is the location of incumbents, which never stops the legislature from double bunking and out bunking people. Yes, ma'am.
I believe I have 3 people who are ceding their time to me.
Okay, just raise your hands if you're ceding your time. Well, I got 1, 2, and yes, I saw that hand over there. Yes.
My name is Nicole Townsend, and I'm an organizer. I live on State Street, which is in West Asheville. I am part of the 75% of Asheville voters who opposed the districting in 2017. And I know that you all have probably been overwhelmed in data, so guess what? I don't have data for you. On June 6th, the Citizens Times published an opinion piece that was submitted by Councilmember Haynes, Smith, and Young. The piece outlined why Asheville should not have districts, and it ended with, "We are Asheville, you are worth fighting for." So it is clear that 3 members of council are ready to put on their sneakers and grease up their faces and fight for us, but are the other 4 ready to do that? And I begin to ask, if folks can't even fight developers, can they fight the state? I want to tell just a short story about one that includes Councilwoman Smith, someone whose leadership I trust and I admire. In 2017, I recall sitting down with, at the time, Shanika Smith, because she was not a councilwoman. So I was sitting down with a friend, and we talked about the spark in people's eyes, because finally we had a candidate that people wanted to vote for because she truly walks with the people. Finally, a vote that can be used in a way that wasn't about voting someone out, but about voting someone in. The people rallied from the north, south, west, and east. Across the city, people were having conversations on their front porches about why we needed Shanika Smith for Asheville. Young Black people who despise local politics walked into a voting booth. Queer and trans folks from across the city finally had a candidate that said, rainbow flags and a pride festival are actually not enough, you deserve more. My elders were proud to pass the torch. If we would have had districts in 2017, I want to know how hard it would have been to get leadership that actually represents the people in office. We can't pretend that districts are not about lessening the opportunities for Black and brown folks to serve as elected officials. In fact, the same representatives who are fighting for districting across North Carolina also had their hand in the pot when it comes to the voter ID laws, which we know are racist. Are we really going to turn away from a fight worthy of our people because it is messy, because it is complicated, and because it is hard? If those are your excuses, then you should step down from your seats. The 75% says that this is not what democracy looks like. The 75% says that there has been much confusion with little time. There has not been a process to fully engage the 75% in a way that has allowed us, the people who voted for y'all, to actually understand what is going on and to actually give adequate feedback about how we, the people, want to move, not the 7 of you. The districts that have been proposed are using the census from 2010, which is inadequate. Councilman Kapoor, I'm wondering if you lived here in 2010. And yes, we know that you want to compromise, that your compromise is 2 additional seats at large, correct?
Just direct your comments to the council in general, please.
That's what I heard on the interview. And I say a compromise is not enough. Councilman Kapoor, will you actually fight for us? We want to vote for everyone who will make decisions that will impact our daily lives. Now is not the time to be a moderate. The 7 who fought are the 7 who compromised. Stand with the 75%. There are too many unknowns about how districting will impact voting in Asheville. If this city does not fight for the people, we may set a precedent that allows the General Assembly to continue to put their hands in a pot that they shouldn't belong in. If this city doesn't fight, you are sending a message that the 75% of voters who do not want districting don't matter. Whether you lose or you win, we are asking you to fight. If you don't fight, you are telling us that we don't matter. The 7 who fought are the 7 who compromised We're asking you to stand with the 75%.
Thank you. Is there, yes, sir.
I'm Dusty Plett. Can you hear me? Yes. I'm Dusty Pless. I've lived in Asheville my entire life. I've been right here. District-wide elections. I served on the Buncombe County School Board for 16 years as the at-large member. So I'm very familiar with district-wide elections. Prior to my election, the Buncombe County School Board, not exactly prior to my elections, but at one time was all at-large. And you talk about school districts that really, some of them that really got nothing. That actually happened. Best thing in the world that happened in Buncombe County was when the school board went to district-wide elections. Okay, the Board of Education, as we currently stand, is district-wide elections. The State House is district-wide elections. The State Senate is district-wide elections. My friend John Mile, he kind of stole my thunder because what I was going to say, you know, if you're running from a district like if I wanted to run, I live in the South, same as Councilman Kapoor. If I wanted to run, I don't have to raise $40,000, $50,000 just to get out of a primary. I could do it, as someone just spoke a minute ago, if I wanted to make some signs on my kitchen table. That is the only fair way, in my opinion, to have fair representation throughout the city. That is the only way to do it. I don't know what's not fair about it. So I support the current bill as written. I hope you do not waste taxpayers' dollars litigating anything. So that's my 2 cents worth. So,
Thank you. In the back, yes, sir.
Hi, my name's Mark Ritzenthaler.
Oh.
I'm a 20-year Asheville resident. Although I wasn't born here, I do think that I have some clout that I volunteered with 6 different nonprofits here in Asheville, including a volunteer team at hospice that's now providing massage therapy 7 days a week from volunteer massage therapists. So I'm part of the 75% of voters who said that we did not want districting in Asheville. I have kind of a neutral question, which is I've been unable to find any information about the data that was used in forming these districts. I want to know if anyone on council is aware of the data that the legislature used in forming the districts as they are now.
I think during the presentation, I believe it was referenced that it was the 2010 census data.
The 2010 census data, and that's all? No other data is aware, no, you're not aware of any other data that was used?
The districts are drawn based on what's called census blocks, and those come from each 10-year census. So yes, it's the numbers in terms of the population count as well as the lines where the districts are drawn is based on that 2010 information.
So what you're seeing is that it was purely drawn on that data only?
They would have other considerations about where they draw the lines, but that's the basis for coming up with the population numbers and exactly where the lines exist around those blocks.
Do you know how to get access to that other information?
The General Assembly's website has the legislative history of bills that you can look at to see what was discussed in terms of their logic for passing bills.
Okay, well, I guess that's as far as I can take the question at this time. It just seems to me that all of the information has not been made available to any of us. And in my opinion, it lacks what in Florida would be the Sunshine Law, which is that everything has to be above board. And if we don't know that everything has been disclosed as far as the data used in forming these districts, I would encourage you to consider that it may have some shady implications. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. All right, now Scott, sorry.
Scott Owen. I oppose the state-imposed districts for a couple reasons. They divide the city up unnecessarily, and they limit the choices that we would have in our elections, as you have to live in the district to run in the district. And I'm going to be blunt now. The Republican Party in this state and around the country has shown its hand and its mind with its willful, deliberate, and effective attacks on the basic principles and the principal necessity of free and fair elections. We have seen and we have had to challenge voter suppression, gerrymandering, and irregularities at the voting booth brought on by the Republican Party. The Republican Party here in North Carolina and throughout the country has cast itself through its own actions as the enemy of free and fair elections. Without any invitation or obvious need, the Republican legislature in Raleigh has inserted itself into Asheville's business, its ability to govern, and now its elections. Elections that have effectively produced the expected outcomes and the makeup of our current city council. There is at this time a concerted effort to strangle our democracy in all three branches of our government, in every city, state, and across the nation. If we cannot stand up for ourselves, for our right to free and fair elections without the manipulating force of the Republicans and a few Democrats in Raleigh, here in Asheville, North Carolina, where will we do so? To quote the famous lover and poet, Leonard Cohen, democracy is coming to the USA. Sail on. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, Jonathan, and then the gentleman in the green shirt. Remind me, I just said that. I'll forget.
I have that.
Are you the reason there's a laptop up there? Okay, all right. Maybe I should have done this first. I'm sorry. Do you want 10 minutes?
I've got 10 minutes.
Okay, the people that are yielding, we got a 1, 2, 3? Yes?
All right.
Okay.
Ready, Maggie? Ready? Go.
Oh.
All right.
He's got his own timer.
It's the 1-year anniversary of the first kind of conversation whatsoever regarding the effect of the African American vote as it pertains to district elections. This is the article that came out last year, and as soon as it did, I was suspicious that this might be just another common excuse to keep Asheville in its at-large districts, because I'd heard quite a lot of excuses over the years. Oh man, this video didn't load. Oh, wait a second, what do we got here? Oh, it didn't work. So anyway, that's Cecil Bothwell from the 2013 League of Women Voters. Oh no, what's happening?
Oh, no. Oh, it just started doing the whole.
Okay.
Oh, that's a horrible.
Pardon me. I'm still learning PowerPoint here. All right, so anyway, I've heard plenty of excuses over the years. I ran for city council in 2013. I've heard that the city wasn't large enough to have districts. That's not true. I've heard that the city is homogeneous, and that's not true. And Cecil Bothwell actually said, well, districts in Chicago have 50,000 people, so if we had districts here, we'd have 1.5 districts, as though a district is a basic unit of measurement. This is the map that was shown in Joel Burgess's article, and this is the district map, okay? This is the new one. So the 6 most populous African-American precincts that Joel mentioned in the article as being broken up into all the different districts, really you see are 2 major areas of town, and you have the top 4 you got 2, 1, 11, and 10 being in central Asheville, and then most of 8.3 and 8.2 in South Asheville. And if you take the data from that map and you put it with this map, what you will see is this is the concentration level of African Americans as an approximation. I can explain that later if you have a question about that. In the 2017 voter registration data. The background of this is shaded to the same level of African Americans registered to vote citywide, which was 11.14% that year. And in West Asheville, you have 6.77%, 21.12% in Central Asheville, 4.08 in North Asheville, 9.1 in East Asheville, and in South Asheville, it is 13, almost 0.6. And so we have two districts that have been created that have a higher percentage of African-American votes than the city at large. And it would have been nice if this kind of data were available before any kind of referendum, because we never had any conversation whatsoever about how this started. But as a lot of people understand these days, this was all because of Republican aggression against Asheville. And this is Chuck Edwards, who sponsored the bill. This is Terry Van Dyne, who authored the even year amendment at the request of the mayor, which has also not been talked about in the press. I know a lot of voters think that their voices aren't being heard, but I have a feeling that the voters aren't being told the right information over the course of the years. And then Terry Van Dyne was abused and bullied in the press again, being shown as a tool of the North Carolina GOP, the Republicans, attacking us. Again, I'm just going to, without too much snark, show you the traitorous 12 Democratic senators who voted aye on Senate Bill 813. It passed with a unanimous vote in the Senate. And these are the traitor turncoat senators who voted to do this. Terry Van Dyne, Mike Woodard, Jeff Jackson, Jay Chaudhry, Dan Blue, Gladys Robinson, Floyd McKissick Jr., Ben Clark, Don Davis, Joyce Waddell, Paul Lowe Jr., Milton Toby Fitch Jr. These are the Republicans. Keith Young said the General Assembly has made sure these maps are so splintered, the African-American voting bloc will be completely wiped out. Completely wiped out. And then Ms. Smith said, it's obvious from the way these district maps are surgically drawn, it will dilute the black vote especially, but there has been no evidence, I haven't seen any data for anybody to prove such a thing. Now, this is Burton Street. Most of us commonly understand Burton Street to be in West Asheville, but the Burton Street neighborhood is included in the central district. So this dwindling African-American community that has been threatened, that probably would have been protected had we had districts all along in the first place, bringing hyper-local attention to the needs of the community. This is in our central district. This is Burton Street. It's in District 2. And so the African-American voters there are joining a population that is 21.21%, twice that of the average. And then, of course, Terry Van Dyne, I think somebody mentioned classism. David Forbes went off on her plenty of times in a bunch of writings. A well-off, basically status quo politician who is easily outmaneuvered and won't put up much of a fight. It's odd that Terry Van Dyne is being labeled as status quo when she's actually changing the election system. And Asheville State Senator is an extremely wealthy white person who lives outside Asheville in the ultra-rich enclave of Biltmore Forest. And Terry Van Dyne had shown a propensity for betrayal and political incompetence. And Terry Van Dyne agreed to support the gerrymandering plan. The new districts are bluntly a racial gerrymander. Terry Van Dyne backed it anyway. And of course, Shanika Smith is a contributing writer to David Forbes, who is her managing editor at the Asheville Blade. The plan's blatantly civil rights violation is likely headed to court one way or the other, because as we know, somebody could sue over this. A common citizen could take a suit over this, like myself, if I wanted to. This is the at-large voting frequently asked questions document produced by the NAACP Legal Defense Fund on what is at-large voting, why is at-large voting discriminatory, how does at-large voting affect community of color, how are single-member districts created. Single-member districts have been a hallmark tool of the civil rights movement to gain access of minority populations at the grassroots level of the political process, and we missed the boat on it. Somebody said that we're not Alabama in 1964. Apparently we are. On November 4th, 2013, the National Association of Colored People Legal Defense Fund wrote a letter to the mayor and city council of Beaufort, South Carolina, threatening legal action if they did not dismantle their at-large system and institute a district system. On that very same day, this is the city council that we elected. Not only is that 6 white people, Cecil Bothwell, Esther Mannheimer, and Mark Hunt all lived in one precinct. Gwen Whistler lived right down the street. 4 representatives from what is now District 2. The new districts will never guarantee anybody a specific chance of winning an election. Your chances are much improved as an African American in this, but they are not guaranteed. But this is guaranteed never to happen again. And what is guaranteed is we will have representation from all over the city. That is guaranteed. And that is why the North Carolina General Assembly had a reason to do this to us. They didn't just do this for no reason. They have a reason to do this. And so what do we have? Well, everybody's trying to sit here and go, what if we do this? What if we do that? Can we do a charter this way? Can we do a charter that way? This is the state of relationship between North Carolina, a General Assembly, and Asheville. I don't care which character you choose to be in this scenario. But as it typically turns out, Jerry gets the upper hand. Now, most of the time in this great American classic, this is what's going on. It's a tit-for-tat battle. There is no checkmate for Asheville when it comes to this. You can do whatever you want, and the North Carolina General Assembly will be able to come undo what you just did. How long do you want to play this game? Every once in a while, Tom and Jerry get along, and I think that that is what we need to do now. Because this is our next senator who is going to be filling the spot of Terry Van Dyne, and we need to have a good relationship with the North Carolina General Assembly, whether you guys like it or not. So I would implore you to move on with what the North Carolina legislature has already told us to do, with the exception of bringing us a primary, because that's crazy, and otherwise this is what the Senate cafeteria is going to look like. Now, I am an expert in equity and inclusion because I am the father of twins, and I can assure you, solving these battles all the time is pretty epic. One night, a few nights ago, Finney, over there on the right, came running in the living room and said, Dad, can I sleep in the top bunk tonight? And I heard Avery coming up right behind him really quickly. And I said, wait a second, son, did you just petition a favor for me without having a full conversation of all of the parties involved just so that you could get me to say yes, so that when Avery came in here, I would already be on board? And he said yes. And I said, what did you do wrong? And he said, well, that's how I did the same thing that the Asheville City Council did when they held the thing. It's time. It is time. It is time for you guys to do what you're supposed to do.
Okay. Yes, let's go. Wait, I said the gentleman with the green shirt. I'm
Yeah.
sorry. It went on and I forgot, and I'm sorry. You'll be next. Yes, I'm sorry. The gentleman in the green shirt, you're, yes. It's now time, your time.
Follow that. Everybody's walking out.
We're going to take away the laptop now because we don't need it anymore. Are we going to keep the
Yeah,
twins
let's-
up?
You want? Wait, Jonathan has to come back to
Okay,
get his.
okay.
There we go.
Yes.
My name
you
is
have-
Robert Lane, and let's see, I'm a Western North Carolina native, but I've only lived in Asheville for 5 years, and I was one of the 75% voting against districts. Thank you all for having this session for us tonight, and thank you especially, City Attorney, for your fantastic presentation. Let's see, what was I going to say? Okay. After that, what can I say? I have been against the idea of districts, but especially after listening to the presentation tonight, it's going to happen. It seems to me it's going to happen. So I think, in my view, the fairest way to be screwed over by the legislature is if we can do, and this is not original with me, and you'll know who this is from. If we're going to have 5 districts, then do have 3 at-large positions, and that means, plus the mayor, okay, right? That would be 4 at-large,
And so I would be voting for, in my district, one person, and then 4 more. That's a majority. I would get to vote for a majority of the council's seats. If we've got to go that way, then that to me seems about the most fair way to do it. But I do have major concerns in this whole thing. I've got concerns about what the rationale really was, or what the reasoning was by the legislature, because they've got a history of surgically screwing over the black vote, quite frankly, in this state. And I'm not sure that's not what's going on here, and that was kind of pretty elegantly presented formally. But I would like to leave 3 things with you. One is, don't ignore Hofflergate, as one of the questioners put it to you. The daughter of Hoffler got his disk drive backups and called Bob Phillips, executive director of Common Cause North Carolina, and gave that information to him. It's been a treasure trove of showing the conniving and lying that's gone on in the gerrymandering and other things, including the desire to place the question of citizenship on the 2020 census, which, thanks to the final nail in the coffin that was found in that treasure trove that shows officials lied, and that it was actually Hoffler suggesting to them to get that on the census to increase the white Republican strength after 2020. The White House today has announced they have withdrawn their request to put that on the 2020 census. So that's how powerful some of this stuff is. You guys need to be in touch with that information. Contact Bob Phillips, get people plowing through this, and see if Hoffler was involved with the decision to stick it to Asheville. Number 2, there apparently is a list of things. Whoa, boy, already. Okay. Make Asheville feel included, but don't dilute the black vote. If it takes non-contiguous districts to put that vote together.
Sorry, we don't have the lights in here.
Am I on, Maggie?
Yeah.
Okay. I want to tell you guys about the pleasure that I have had voting for council and voting for the mayor here in Asheville. I met VJ during the election this past year. I really enjoyed meeting you and talking with you. And I didn't get a chance to vote for you in this past election because there were so many candidates. Every other person sitting up there, I have voted for most of you multiple times. No, not most, half of you. Yeah, multiple times. Because all of you haven't been on the council that long. I have mentioned this online to people I meet, to people I talk to about this issue. What it means to me to have the choose 3 on the ballot. When I go to choose 3, I'm picking that person who represents me best, Cecil Bothwell, and then I pick 2 other people to kind of balance out and maybe fill in some of the shortcomings. And I come up with a slate of candidates. And then he got knocked out in the primary, so I added another candidate to my vote. And Shanika over there was somebody that I had the honor to vote for in this past election during the general election. And it's not that everybody I vote for wins. Usually it's 1 or 2 of the 3 people. But it has me feeling like there's somebody on council that I've voted for, and I really feel like I can reach out to you guys, and when there's issues that come up in our school system or other things that come up, I really feel like council is there for the public. And I think that choose 3 approach to selecting candidates has a big impact. So I guess what I'm asking council to do initially, I think VJ has put forth a good idea. And I think that would be a great thing to put on the ballot as a referendum if you guys are in agreement that it's a good idea. But in the meantime, I ask you to pass a charter amendment, one of the approaches that's been suggested, so that we go back to as close as possible to the way things were before Senate Bill 13. And again, I thank you for serving. Great presentation from our new city attorney.
Thanks. Okay, so remember, if you've already yielded your time, you can't speak tonight, but of course, we'll have more council meetings. Yes, ma'am.
My name is Darlene Azarmi. I have a couple folks who are going to cede time to me.
Okay.
I don't think I'll take all that time, but wow. I would just like to acknowledge that I heard about the presentation last week, and I think that that is a white man that is just not aware of his privilege. And to put those images up on the screen and in the tone that he did, and just to assert what he did without words, although he used words to my understanding last week, is incredibly offensive. And I would hope there would be less interaction and approval of that behavior from y'all in the future.
Okay, we're not talking about the city attorney. You were talking about Jonathan.
Yes,
Yes,
okay.
okay.
Yes,
I was
thank you.
wondering.
And to clarify, yes. No, the man that was just here, yes. And thank you for on that note, thank you for your information and thank you for the presentation, because I think a lot of that folks hadn't heard before. Just needed to acknowledge that, because that was incredibly offensive and really disgusting. So thank you for holding this open work session. Unfortunately, though, there was no prior agenda or information really given about this meeting, so I would just say that there should be improvement in that process of involving people. And, this meeting, as we've heard, really should have been held a long time ago. That being said, I really feel a large part of the reason that we're here today is because council didn't act with due urgency. I don't think that y'all took this attempt to undermine your authority very seriously. You thought kicking it to the people would work enough as a pushback, but putting all your eggs in that basket was your strategical error. Now, when the people are asking you to back their 75% strong rejection of districts, you're saying that you don't know the best path to move forward, and then it might be too expensive. It wasn't an issue to pass a $4.5 million budget unanimously, yet we can't get an investment to protect the integrity of our elections and ensure that people of color have a fair shot at being represented in Asheville. I was also really disturbed by using the NAACP information from the LDF saying that at-large districts are a bad thing, because although that is known as general knowledge, which I've learned through being on the phone with lawyers a lot about this issue and trying to understand more about it, that's not the case for Asheville. And so later I'll mention just the importance of really understanding and enforcing that Asheville is not like every other place, and so at-large districts finally have started working for communities of color in here to get elected seats. And so essentially now, it's like we're taking that away. We just got here to a place where people from traditionally, quote, marginalized groups, and I say that word because it is used to define that legally, these are the folks that built this town in a lot of ways, and yet now that we're just able to get representation, the system's going to be changed. And so again, it's important that we consider who proposed this and acknowledge that it's the same racist authors of the photo ID law, and who is rubber stamping it or could, that would be silent or defiant members of council at this time. So let me be clear, personally, I feel that almost everything about the unfolding of this process has been unacceptable. There should have been a deep analysis and strategizing as soon as this came down. Instead, a year later, here we are in a manufactured time crunch trying to figure out what to do. And it isn't on citizens to figure out what to do. It is on you all, in my opinion. We need you to push back at all costs, and we need you to fight. And the people do not want districts. That's very clear. In my opinion, I would really like y'all to suit up and get ready to go to court. I think that the charter could just be an endless game of back and forth, as we saw, Tom and Jerry. I also think there's really scary implications for the rest of the state that should be deeply considered before that's pursued. But beyond that, I think that an injunction on the districts, especially given all the information about the census, I think that would be the best option. Would be trying to get a stay on this in the courts, likely through the Equal Protection Clause. But again, that's for you all and further legal counsel to determine. The fact is, we can't permanently change the way that elections work in Asheville because y'all didn't do your homework, and a new idea seems like an easy fix. It's not our fault that we've been left in the dark, and while it seems almost nothing's been done on this critical issue, what we need is transparency, inclusion, and integrity. To me, saying we don't think we have a strong case is cowardly given the past and present day injustices and racism in our politics and in Asheville and throughout North Carolina. Money's wasted all of the time in government. Standing up with and for the citizens who asked you not to district Asheville is not a waste of money, it's a duty. I'd like to highlight that lawyers who are advising you from Raleigh and DC cannot find the true story of the shattered community in statistics or articles online or precedents. Only y'all and people who are truly from this community could understand how devastating districts could be, and that is only if you choose to listen to those stories. We heard some tonight, and there are many more out there. Further, if outside groups won't step up to the plate, which my understanding is they won't, a lawsuit on behalf of the city is really, or action on behalf of the city, whether it's a charter or a lawsuit, is the only way forward. But I think it's really ridiculous to wait, for a citizen lawsuit with an issue this sensitive. And we all know that this General Assembly, especially in the wake of a potentially turning political tide, is going to push back at all costs. We know that from experience. So just, instead of throwing on a few at-large seats, that doesn't really make a lot of sense for this community, the best route really would be to stop the law in its tracks legally. On the note of these adding additional at-large seats, the only other cities that have 9 or more council seats out of the 100 counties in North Carolina are Charlotte, which in the 2010 census had a population of 731,424, so they had 11 seats, and Fayetteville, which had a population of 200,564, so they had 9 seats. So all of the other counties in North Carolina typically have 5 to 6, sometimes 7 or 8 seats on council. Certainly none, Asheville size, have 9. So speaking of concern about wasting money in litigation, wouldn't it cost an extra $45,000 per year to add 2 council members? And if so, 5 or more years of those additional at-large seats would amount to the potential cost of litigating against these districts in the name of the ethics and justice for which you're supposed to serve. I feel that this last-minute idea is a distraction that's being used to trick voters into compromising the integrity of elections. If we don't understand the true impact of solutions, then they should not be considered, period. Additionally, voters are already facing big changes to their voting experience in North Carolina, a strict photo ID requirement, as well as big changes attempting to limit early voting, both traditionally used by working class, people of color, and transient folks. Both of these were also handed down by the General Assembly. Similarities. The Board of Elections would really be too strapped to educate people on new districts as well. Have you thought about that? How are they supposed to pay for more early voting hours and educate people if there are new districts? Who would pay for all of that? Honestly, the Board of Elections are too hesitant right now to even use the machines they have to print photo IDs because of capacity and budget concerns. And I know that from our advocates who monitor the Board of Elections. Being present at polls every year, I can just imagine now the mass confusion over precincts, coming together with a photo ID law, coming together with altered early voting hours, and then new council districts in 2020, a recipe for disaster for everyday voters, at least. There are too many unknowns and too much uncertainty to move forward in true confidence with any of the plans on the table. It's clear that redrawing districts using nearly 10-year-old data right before a new census makes no sense. Asheville has more than the 83 or some odd people that were used at that time and has changing POC populations. The Black population in Asheville has likely declined in part due to gentrification, which makes it more important to scrutinize split districts and deviations in data so that we can ensure that voting power is not diminished, which is very real, right? Putting the currently proposed districts into effect will compromise the voting power of people of color. There is no question about that. Have you asked the community or just looked at turnout of regular voters in Asheville? Because there is a difference. The more barriers there are to voting, the less likely people are to vote. Do we need to be mentioned again in the New York Times or in an article that says, quote, when a liberal city doesn't fight a racist gerrymander, end quote, to make that clear? Y'all cannot in good conscience punt like the courts did on redistricting and say this is not your issue, this is our issue, and now it is your issue to figure out. Time is wasting. The people have been left out of this process for too long. We now need to be included in and aware of any steps moving forward. Please do better in letting us know what is going on from this point forward. We need to know what the process is going to be from here very clearly and notified with time to make it out. Please fight to delay any decision on this until after the 2020 census. Push back on districts at all costs. Take this issue to the court and fight. Explore options you hadn't thought of before. Give this issue the time and attention it deserves. It is at the core of all issues facing Asheville today. Who represents Asheville is Asheville. And this is unfair that it's gotten this far. Going back to the cases that were mentioned several times tonight, we have Common Cause versus Lewis, and then we have this redlining. You know, in the wake of the decision of the Supreme Court on gerrymandering, there are many things to consider right now. So I ask you consider all avenues and get as much legal counsel as you possibly can on this.
Thank you. All right, is there anyone who has not yielded their time and who would like to speak?
Mayor, I just want to note as a point of fact, High Point, North Carolina also has 9 council members, and they have a population around 111,000.
I'm Carol Rogoff Hallstrom. I live in North Asheville, and I vote. For all this period of time, I'm just looking at you and wondering, what is the problem that we're trying to solve? How representative we have become as a city legislative body. The obligation, it seems to me, others have talked about the outdated data on which the legislative mandate is based. Others have talked about the 2017 referendum that was passed by such a sizable margin. I just think you're obligated, frankly, at a time when our federal government, when our state government are acting in ways that increasingly seem to endanger democracy, that we as a city not become complicit with behaviors that do that. You have options. We've had the opportunity, thank you, to learn of options to proceed. The only option I would urge you not to take is to do nothing. That would put us in the same, I think, sad and rather frightening condition of our federal and state governments, the motion. We count and we look to you to make sure that our voices are heard. I'm Carol Rogoff Hallstrom, and I vote.
Thank you. Okay, the gentleman back here.
Rick Schell. I've lost a lot of respect for 4 of you this last week, and not just because you fake listening to the people of Asheville when you really listen to developers and tourists, and you change your mind and you sit here looking angry, and you pretend for bipartisanship because we should listen equally to one side and the other, when most people are on one side, and so people have to leave and go, and people aren't heard. A black woman just left. She wanted to talk, but because you delay and you won't own up to what's really happening. We're under attack by the Republican legislature. This is not a time when you can be political and smooth things out. This is a time when our city is under attack. And you have to face that. And they play dirty, as we've seen. The Republicans are willing to cheat. So you have to fight for us. 75%. That's not nothing. That's not close. 75% of us voted for no districts, keeping things the way we do it in Asheville. And you can't figure out what to do? How hard is it? How dumb are some of you? Because 3 of you know what to do, and the others just can't figure it out. We need to like have some kind of powwow and study. When you're under attack, what do? When your city is under attack and you're supposed to be the elected leaders, are you fighting for us or this now empty room because you have to go through a long process before you can listen to the people who you're supposed to be representing? We have an illegally constituted state legislature, and you're creatures of the state, as the lawyer put it, right? But you're elected by the people of Asheville. And if it takes till 2020 to have an election or 2022, we will vote some of you out because you don't listen to us anymore. You listen to the money.
Thank you.
So thank you to those of you who still listen to us.
Yes, ma'am.
Hello, my name is Sarah Benoit. I'm a local business owner. I don't want to repeat too much of what everybody said, but I did want to touch on a couple different points. First, I did want to say I've been coming to City Council for every meeting except for one in 2019, and I was invited by people who'd been going to City Council on this issue for at least 2 to 3 months prior to me joining them 6 months ago. So the locals have asked you to address this for a long time. So to act like it's a big surprise that we wanted to talk about it almost a year ago is kind of ridiculous, in my opinion. Also, I want to say there are plenty of Republicans that have a problem with what's going on with the gerrymandering and districting in North Carolina. So I have emailed all of you a presentation that I put together that outlines that it's not just Democrats that have a problem with this. Republicans have a problem with it as well. It is bipartisan on a lot of levels. And for people who are going to get up here and claim that this benefits communities of color, I'd like to know where those communities are and why they're not here standing up for what's going to benefit them. Because so far, I haven't seen one person of color stand up here and say that us going to districts does them a giant favor in the city of Asheville. So for a bunch of white men to stand up here and claim that seems really irritating to me and not very representative of what is the truth. Also, as somebody who's in the LGBT community, I feel that a lot of our community is spread out across the city. And also as somebody who's working class, and I mean that's somebody who makes $30,000 a year. That's what I mean by working class, people who make under $50,000 a year. We are spread out all over the city because we can't afford to live downtown and we've been moved further and further out. And so I don't see how breaking us up into districts helps either of those communities come together and vote for our city council in a way that represents us. So I'm not going to speak for communities that I'm not a part of, but the communities I am a part of, I'm really bothered that the argument is that this is going to help us be stronger. Gerrymandering is, basically done through what they call cracking and packing. So there's so many different ways that this can hurt different minorities in our city. Also, after living here for 20 years, I feel it's incredibly important that our at-large elections continue. I feel like it matters to me that I got to have the chance to vote for many of you. And I think that to say I shouldn't have a right to vote for you down the road is really frustrating. I feel like it disempowers me as a voter. It basically makes me feel like now that I'm not in your district in the South or the North, now I get to say nothing about your behavior and the way that you treat the rest of the community. So I think in Asheville, we believe we're all one community. I think most of us think of ourselves as the city of Asheville. I don't think of myself as West Asheville. And that's why at-large elections are important.
Thank you. Okay, is there anyone else who did not cede their time that wants to speak during this? Are you raising? Oh, raise them higher than like, high up, okay. Did you want to speak as well? Is there anyone else wishing to speak? Kim, come on up, and is there anyone else wishing to speak? Okay, so you'll be our last speaker. Okay.
My name is Kim Roney. I'm one of the 75% who voted to not district the city in the referendum. In the summer of 1919, 100 years ago, my great-grandmother, who was born in Asheville, was witnessing women gain the right to vote. Today, our access to the polls is threatened at every turn, and again, voter rights is one of the biggest issues facing our country. We heard this week the Supreme Court of the United States ruled to wash their hands of gerrymandered districts. They're not going to protect our vote. With bipartisan support of Senate Bill 813, it appears our legislators who do not live in the city limits are more interested in maintaining power than protecting our vote. So the decision to ensure Asheville's current and future voters have access to holding our local electeds accountable is up to you. Since it is your instruction to the city attorney that is our last chance in a decision that will change our city forever. We have voted on a referendum, begged and pleaded for over the past year for you to protect our vote. Today, I'm here to add 3 notes to the chorus to assure provisions that would allow us to reassess the maps once the census data is updated. 2, bring on a professional in census data and mapping. And 3, look at which districts will be appointing school board members when their districts aren't served by city schools, for example, District 5 in South Asheville. I am still hearing compromise that means actively supporting the efforts of the North Carolina General Assembly to split us up in a time of incredible divisiveness. A time when more than ever, we need to be uniting together and looking for every opportunity to collaborate for solutions on climate change response, equitable economic stability, affordable housing, and the achievement and opportunity gap in our schools. This is the year that will go down in history as the year each of you got an extra year in office. The year you allowed conditional use for hotels in every corner of our city. The year you chose consultant fees over housing, trees, and transit hours. The year you risked district decisions by dragging this conversation on way too long. I am more than disappointed because I care about each one of you and your families. I am ashamed. I am ashamed of you. All of you. In the name of all the people who gave their lives for the right of the people to vote, who fought for inclusivity and the equality at the polls, who are just now being mobilized to participate with their vote, who will be distilling information for new and eligible registered voters, move your hearts, move your minds, send this to capable people like Anita Earls, who knows how to fight for voter rights. Protect our votes. Please fight the districts.
Okay, and our last speaker, yes.
Ladies and gentlemen of the council, I am Jeffrey DeCristofaro. I live in North Asheville, and I too vote, but I will do my best not to be so vehement in my assessment of the situation. As a matter of fact, I'm going to let facts rather than feelings take precedence. Something that came up when we were holding the discussion earlier about the claim about, option free. One, our Part C, Gerrymandering Voting Rights Act claim, it says here that city must show that race was the predominant factor motivating the district's shape and/or demographics, but it is not the only factor. It has excluded others: women, people with disabilities, veterans, so many others. Also, according to this, it says here that the test under the Voting Rights Act requires a minority group is sufficiently large and geographically compact to constitute a majority at the expense of the majority. And also that these cases require very specialized experts to provide necessary evidence. All I can do is look very carefully, read them very closely, and say to yourself, be afraid, be very, very afraid. Because here, saying that race is the predominant factor motivating the district shape and/or demographics is more a case of scapegoating, convenient scapegoating, at the behest of a few and not the many. And also, that the cases saying that they require very specialized experts to provide necessary evidence would require the experts to be, again at the behest of the minority, the white Republican minority, biased, firmly biased, willing to sugarcoat anything, and therefore try to cover a dark picture, kind of like sweeping it under the rug. Here, I speak from the facts. The decade is nearly coming to a close, and we have suffered so much from people who are beholden to their own corporate interests rather than to the lives of the many or to causes that are far more noble than to their own. I therefore asked the City Council of Asheville to please stand up not only for what is right, but for what is fact. Free of religious bias, free of racial bias, free of any bias whatsoever. Because I can give you a fact that unless this is done, unless you heed the call, unless you stop giving in to any people filled with false pretenses, particularly on the GOP level or the extremist conservative right, or the Republican Congress statewide or nationwide, Asheville will no longer become the Appalachian Shangri-La or the Paris of the South that it was once referred to. I ask that you step up and tell people to accept the facts. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, that concludes the public comment period of the work session. We don't have any other items on our agenda for this evening. We are not voting on anything this evening, but council, if there's any comments, I'll ask if you have anything to say. That's obviously perfectly fine. This council will next have an opportunity to visit this. I think what our city attorney was explaining to us is that because of the attorney-client privilege concerns, you would want the next consultation to be a closed session, I assume, is what you are recommending?
Dependent upon the topic, and I believe if we took this into a strategic analysis, that would be the proper forum for us, yes.
But any decision of council, of course, will need to be voted on in an open session, again, with opportunity for comment from the public. Keith, you look like you were.
Yeah, the only thing that I would say is that I don't have in my mind when the next council meeting is. I know it's quite some time out.
End of July.
End of July.
July 23rd.
July 23rd.
July 23rd. So to have information immediately available at the earliest possible convenience of the city attorney.
Would be preferred.
Yes, would be preferred.
One other thing I would like to add, Darlene spoke earlier, she's gone now, I think, but she did help connect us, and I know Shanika did as well. We took an opportunity to talk to some nonprofit groups that do take on litigation on behalf of, in districting cases, and just to see if there was anybody, any entity, any group out there that would be willing to take on our cause from a litigation standpoint. Obviously, you saw there's a lot of cost involved to do this if we were to initiate a litigation. So just to do our due diligence, make sure there wasn't any group out there that would be willing to take on our case. From my conversations, there isn't, and I'm not actually too surprised because they typically are doing the congressional and state House and Senate challenges. Although in the Wake County School Board case, there was a group that took on that case. So, but just so that information is out there that that effort was made. So that doesn't look like an opportunity for us, but we obviously can bring our own action if we so choose. Anybody else otherwise? All right, we are adjourned.